I think one of the most important things that people need to think about when they're getting started in their business is really how they structure their business setup, or a lot of times we'll refer to it in the trade as business formation or a business formation practice. It's funny that some people think that when they're getting started in a business that they're actually going through a selection process. Do I pick a sole proprietorship, for example, or do I pick a limited liability company, or do I pick a corporation? And in some of those instances, that's correct. But what most people don't get is that when you start in business, you automatically start as one of those, and that is as a sole proprietorship. The reason is this: the Internal Revenue Service thinks it's important for its particular functions that it collect taxes whenever money is earned. And so when you're a sole proprietor, that means you're a single person and that you're out in commerce, you're out in the business world, and you are attempting to get an income flow so that you can support yourself and support the business activities. Well, Uncle Sam wants to get a piece of that action. And so what they say is that if you're going to go out into business with no thought or structure or anything, and you're all by yourself, we are going to deem that you are a sole proprietor. And what we expect of you is that at the end of a calendar year, we want you to account for all of your income, and in addition, we'll let you account for all of your expenses, and then what we're going to do is collect a tax from you on the net difference between what you were able to earn in your business and what it cost you to run that business. So they're going to tax you on the net profit, and you're going to fall onto a schedule of taxation, and then you're going to pay some piece of that profit as a tax. In the eyes of the Internal Revenue Service and in the eyes of the state law, you are in fact a sole proprietor, and just the moment you commence business, you have certain responsibilities. For example, the first one is, as we talked about, is that you're going to have responsibility of keeping track of all the money that your company earns. And then you're going to have the responsibility of keeping track of all the reasonable business expenses that you incurred. Then you're going to be required to come up with a net number and then pay the taxes. So that's the first thing. The other thing, of course, is that when you start to operate a business, other government entities will jump in, and they're going to want to make sure that you're paying your fair dues to them too. For example, I had a client call me and said that he wants to start a small business out of his house. Should he consider being a sole proprietor, or should he consider being a corporation? And so I had the same conversation with him, that by default he's going to be a sole proprietor, and as a consequence there are certain things that he's going to need to do just in order to do his first step in business. Being a corporation, or walking through that analysis, is really a second piece of, or second major piece of the equation. But he was still back in the sole proprietor phase, and he said, well, if I'm going to start my business, what are the things that I need to consider when I'm doing something like that? One of the things that he needs to consider is that the second that he's operating his business, he's going to fall into the regulations of the particular city that he's doing business in. You would think that I can start my business anywhere I want and do anything that I want, but that's not true. Every city has its own set of regulations on businesses. Most businesses are acceptable. However, there's a short list of businesses that are not acceptable and will not be licensed by the city under any circumstances. Right now, for example, one of the more controversial things is whether or not a city is going to license a dispensary to distribute marijuana or not. Distribution of marijuana is against the federal law. It's currently fine with state law if you follow certain very regimented procedures in doing the distribution, but it's against seemingly public policy of many cities, and they've currently set up laws that prevent the distribution of marijuana, or that prevent the distribution of opening a dispensary, or prevent a number of other behaviors. So if someone were to simply say, well, I want to be in the marijuana business, and go into their apartment and put a sign on their front door, say, welcome one and all, come on in, I'm a marijuana dispensary. As soon as the city finds that out, they'll come into the premises, they'll shut it down and probably arrest the proprietor, which is really not a good thing. So one of the first things that people really need to do is go down to the city where they're planning on opening up their business and have a conversation with the business licensing folks to make sure that the business that they're intending on opening can in fact be licensed in the city, one, and two, whether or not it can be licensed in that particular location. For example, I've got another client that happens to be in the automobile business, and though it's acceptable business in general to sell automobiles, there are city and there are state restrictions on where and how those businesses can be operated. So a small business owner is prudent to go down to the city licensing bureau and make certain that the particular location where they're interested in opening their business is acceptable to the city. And then if that business is licensed by any other local or state or federal government, that before the business gets open, you need to make certain that it's acceptable to run that kind of business in that location with all of the government agencies, not just one. For example, in the situation where I had a client who wanted to run an automobile dealership, though the city may not have cared whether or not he did it out of his house, since we're sort of in a virtual world, the California Department of Motor Vehicles has certain restrictions placed on licensing to people who are in the retail sales business, and they actually require a physical location, and they require room enough to park a couple of vehicles, which may be a problem when you're running your business out of an apartment. So again, that's just an example of why you'd want to be mindful of the licensing part of the business, even if you're a sole proprietor. The next thing that you want to think about when you're operating as a sole proprietor is that on a number of occasions you're asked to provide a tax identification number. For an individual, that is what we call the Social Security number, and these days, because of the high incidence of identity theft and misuse of Social Security numbers, people and business owners in particular are very reluctant to furnish their Social Security numbers just because of the major problems that they can occur with identity theft. So a prudent sole proprietor, what they would do is they would contact the Internal Revenue Service and they would make application for a tax identification number for their business. It also, in essence, is kind of a Social Security number. It's a number that, once obtained by the Internal Revenue Service, is used by the business owner to associate all of their business income and business expenses with that number. So when they do their tax return at the end of the year, they will file a tax return referencing that particular number. And so the Internal Revenue Service is happy. And when they go do business with other businesses that might ask for a tax identification number so that they can get a tax write-off for certain items or inventory or products that second business might be selling, that the business owner can say, well, here's my tax identification number, and not reveal their own personal Social Security number, which is, again, very important. So we've talked about the importance of getting a business license. We've talked about getting a tax identification number that could be different from the owner's Social Security number. Another thing that many people starting businesses want to do is start a business and use a name other than their own name. So, for example, let's say that I decide that I want to set up an automobile dealership and I don't want to use the name Andy Gale Auto Sales. What do? Well, there's a requirement placed upon us by probably every county in the state and probably in every state in the union, and that is that if we want to run or operate a business with a name that does not contain our surname, our last name, and a lot of times it's a first and last name, then what we've got to do is we've got to go down to the county where our business is located, and we've got to file for or complete an application for what we call a fictitious business name. A lot of times it's referred to a fictitious business name statement. A lot of times people will also refer to it as a DBA or a doing business as. So let's say that I don't like the idea of having Andy Gale Auto Sales, but I would much rather have, for branding purposes, something like Blue Moon Auto Sales. Well, the thing that I would do is I would go down to the county office or the county seat. I would go, in the case of our county, Orange County, California, what I would do is go down to the Orange County Recorder's Office, and these days you can also do the filing online, but you would go down to the Orange County Recorder's Office and you would fill out the application that the county's provided. It's typically a 2 or 3 page application. One of the requirements of doing the application is that you conduct a search, countywide search, to see whether or not someone else is using that same fictitious business name. If it's not being used, it would be deemed available, and then what you could do is make application for it. The process ordinarily takes from start to finish several weeks, because not only must you file an application with the county recorder, but you also must, once you've got the application filed with the county recorder, you must publish the name in a newspaper of general circulation. Now, 40 or 50 years ago, it used to make a lot of sense. There were only 2 or 3 newspapers that were being circulated. And the idea was that if you want to do business with a fictitious business name, why, it would give members of the community an opportunity to object or complain or do something like that. And so it used to be in this filing, and this notice used to be contained in a newspaper that everybody would read. However, these days, in more modern times, not many people read the newspaper, and they've actually created newspapers, physical newspapers, that their only role in life is just to do these publications. I think it's sort of history and kind of a really a silly rule now, because no one actually goes to these newspapers. No one would know about them, but for people who are either in the business of charging people to do this fictitious business name notice stuff, or lawyers that help people get fictitious business names. But there you are, we're still stuck with this kind of traditional way of putting notices into paper and giving people an opportunity to complain about the name. But you don't actually get the name, it's not locked down until the notice and publication period is completed. So what will happen is that you get the paperwork from the county recorder's office, then you will do the publication process. There's a fee with the county, there's also a fee with the newspaper company, and then what they'll do is they'll publish it 3 or 4 times, and then once the publication is complete, the newspaper will send you proof, which will later become part of your corporate records or part of your business records. Then you will be permitted to do business in a name other than your own. And this is important because, for example, if I want to just do Blue Moon Auto Sales and I run down to the bank and say, hey bank, I want to open up a business banking account and I want to open it up in the name of Blue Moon Auto Sales, the bank will not permit you to do that unless you show up with the application that's been filed with the county, and you also show up with the publication notice. That'll be a requirement placed upon the bank. So getting a fictitious business name is an important component to getting a business started. Just one last note, that just because the county allows you to use the name Blue Moon Auto Sales, that doesn't mean that there may not be another company that's using it somewhere else in California, and they may have trademark rights to that particular name. So a prudent business owner is well served by not only doing a search of that name with the county recorder's office, but it would be also a good idea to go to the California Secretary of State's website, take a look under their business entity section, and in there there'll be a name search section, and you can also search the name to see if someone has incorporated their business or formed a limited liability company using that name, and if they are, you're probably well served by thinking about another name. One last place to check, if you want to be very careful about it, is you could do the same sort of search through the United States Patent and Trademark Office. That's called the USPTO, and you can find that at uspto.gov, but you can also do a similar search just to see if there's maybe another large company that has previously used the name and might send you a cease and desist letter telling you that you are in fact in violation of their trademark use of their name. So a lot of times it's not a problem if it's a small business and it's one county. Some companies don't care, but I had the instance of one client, before they were actually a client of mine, had done a lot of work on branding, and they got signs put up on their building, they had their stationery done, their business cards done, and lo and behold, they'd actually taken a name of a company that was very protective of their trademark, which was unfortunately for them the same name. After an expensive round with attorneys, they were forced to change their name, which was a big blow to their branding and a big blow to their bottom line and their business. So it's very worthwhile going through this process and just making sure that that's a name that's acceptable to the county and also one that's not going to violate another business owner's trademark.